I always thought my shadow was just that, a simple dark projection of my body. I saw it reflected on the pavement when the sun shone or drawn on the walls by a lamp at night. It was silent, obedient, and always there, but I never gave it much thought. Over time, something strange began to happen. I started noticing that it didn't always move in sync with me. Sometimes it seemed to have a life of its own, as if it made decisions without me. At first, I ignored it, attributing it to an overactive imagination or tricks of the light. But there was something about my shadow, something that unsettled me. It began to appear at times when it shouldn't, or moving in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just a reflection, it was something deeper. And so, slowly, I realized that this shadow wasn't just an external presence, it was a part of me I had been avoiding, a part that was trying to tell me something, to show me what I had repressed for years. Now, looking back, I realize how much I regret not understanding it sooner. As a child, my shadow was merely a game. It jumped, ran, twirled, and was always there, like a faithful companion. But over time, that game faded into the routine of daily life. I grew up, and with that, I stopped paying attention to it. However, something changed when I was about 20. On a calm afternoon, with the sun high in the sky, I noticed something unusual while walking in the park. My shadow seemed to move slightly before I did. It wasn't a big difference, just a fraction of a second, but enough to make me stop and observe. I thought it was a trick of the light or my tired mind, so I continued on, but the feeling persisted. From that moment on, I began to notice details I hadn't seen before. It was as if my shadow behaved differently when I wasn't looking directly at it. It moved with a subtle independence, as if it were not just a projection of me but an entity with its own will. That idea shook me, but I told myself I was being irrational. A few months later, something more unsettling happened. It was night, and I was in my room with a lamp beside me. As I was preparing to sleep, I saw my shadow projected on the wall. But, for some reason, my shadow was slightly more upright than I was. I was sitting, relaxed, and the shadow seemed to be in a state of alert, almost as if it were observing me. Fear ran down my spine. What was happening? I turned off the lamp immediately, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Over time, I began to research shadows. I wanted to understand if there was a rational explanation for what I was seeing. What I found was fascinating but also disturbing. In many cultures, shadows have special significance beyond the physical. In ancient Greece, it was believed that the shadow was a representation of the soul. The Egyptians thought that the Aka, a kind of spiritual shadow, followed people even after death. The most striking revelation was reading about Carl Jung, the psychologist who described something called the shadow, in terms of the human mind. According to Jung, everyone has an internal shadow, a part of our psyche that contains repressed aspects of our personality, desires we don't want to admit, fears we deny, and everything we don't show to the world. For him, the shadow wasn't something external but a representation of our unconscious. It was as if I was reading about my life, as if those words described what I was experiencing. I began connecting the dots. My shadow wasn't just the physical silhouette following me when there was light. It was a manifestation of something deeper, something buried inside me that I had completely ignored. And, without realizing it, that hidden part of me was starting to emerge, trying to be recognized. But what was it trying to tell me? The more I researched, the more unsettling the feeling became that my shadow was not just a reflection. In literature, shadows have always played a mysterious role. Think of Peter Pan, who lost his shadow and had to sew it back onto his body. Or Dracula, whose shadow seemed to move independently. In many stories, shadows are entities with power, more than just simple reflections. And what troubled me most was that my experience seemed to fit that pattern. My shadow was trying to communicate something, but what? I started asking myself questions I had never considered before. What part of me was repressed? What aspects of my personality or my life was I ignoring? The answers didn't come immediately, but I began to notice subtle changes. In my daily life, I felt a growing sense of unease. Moments where something as simple as looking at my reflection in a window made me question who I really was. I felt like there was something within me that I had been avoiding facing for years. Then I remembered a conversation I had with a close friend. We had talked about how we often live fragmented lives, showing only certain parts of ourselves to the world while hiding others. I wondered if my shadow, that dark part of me, was a representation of everything I had avoided showing, fears, insecurities, even desires I had never acknowledged. It was as if my shadow was carrying all of that, and now, in some way, it was trying to get me to confront it. But how does one face their shadow? How do you reconcile with the parts of yourself that you've ignored for so long? I didn't have clear answers, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. My shadow was there, following me everywhere, but it was no longer just a silent companion. It was alive, in a sense, reflecting everything I didn't want to see. From that moment on, I began to look at my shadow differently. It was no longer just a physical projection. It was a doorway to a part of myself that I had ignored, and although it scared me, I also knew it was time to face it. As the days went by, the feeling of unease only grew. The shadow, which had once been an insignificant detail in my life, had become a constant presence. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was hallucinations, mere optical illusions. But how could you ignore something that seemed increasingly real? The little oddities I had noticed became more frequent. My shadow not only seemed to move before I did but also began to adopt postures that didn't match mine. I was standing, but it would lean, as if leaning to observe me. I was still, but it seemed to move, exploring its surroundings in a way that sent chills down my spine. One night, the breaking point came. I had had an especially long and exhausting day. As I was getting ready to go to bed, I saw my shadow projected on the wall, as usual. However, something was terribly wrong. As I leaned toward the mirror to brush my teeth, my shadow remained still. I froze, staring at the reflection, unable to process what I was seeing. And then, as if to prove that I wasn't losing my sanity, the shadow moved. It wasn't a subtle movement, it was intentional, as if it made its own decision. It stood up completely while I was still leaning over the sink. Panic overwhelmed me. I felt a sort of vertigo, a disconnection between my body and my shadow. I recoiled, my heart racing. For a long while, I couldn't take my eyes off the wall. My shadow was there, still, but I no longer saw it the same way. It was as if it had come to life, as if it were watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the bed with the lights on, watching the shadow. Every tiny movement of my body seemed amplified, distorted in that dark figure that now terrified me. The following days were a nightmare. I couldn't focus at work, and I couldn't talk about it with anyone without sounding like I was losing my mind. How do you explain that your shadow has a life of its own? Every time I went outside or entered a lit room, I couldn't help but glance sideways to see what my shadow was doing. Sometimes it was normal, perfectly in sync with me. Other times, without warning, it seemed to take on a slightly different form, as if it were denser or moved with a will that wasn't mine. It was at this point that I began to doubt my own sanity. I wondered if I was imagining everything, if stress or lack of sleep was playing tricks on my mind. I thought about seeing a doctor, a psychologist, someone who could explain what was happening. But what would I say? My shadow has a life of its own. I knew it would sound ridiculous. I knew they would diagnose me with something, medicate me, or worse, tell me it wasn't real. So I stayed silent, trying to get through each day with that oppressive secret that seemed to be taking control of my life. One afternoon, exhausted from so much fear, I decided to do something different. I couldn't continue ignoring what was happening, but I also didn't want to fall into despair. So I sat on the floor of my living room, turned on a lamp, and watched my shadow on the wall. I wanted to confront it. I wanted to understand what was going on. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, knowing how absurd it sounded to talk to a shadow. But at that moment, I couldn't think of another option. I was desperate for an answer, for some sign that I wasn't losing my mind. To my surprise, something changed. It wasn't a physical change but a sensation. As I looked at it, a clarity began to emerge in my mind. I remembered Carl Jung's words about the shadow, that part of our psyche that we repress. Everything we don't want to confront, our fears, dark desires, the mistakes we try to forget. Everything we push to the back of our minds but never really disappears. I began to realize that, perhaps, my shadow was a physical representation of everything I had been avoiding. Maybe, on some level, I had been running from myself for years. As days passed, I began to analyze my life in more detail. What was it that I didn't want to face? What parts of myself had I ignored? I remembered moments from my childhood, past mistakes, desires, and fears that I had never allowed myself to express. It was as if my shadow was gathering all those fragments of my life and showing them to me in the most unsettling way possible. I couldn't keep ignoring it. The conflict was not just with my shadow. It was with myself. I had been living a half-life, showing the world only a carefully edited version of who I was. But everything I had repressed, everything I had hidden, was still there, waiting to be confronted. My shadow was forcing me to face my own demons. Accepting it wasn't easy. At first, I struggled with the idea. I wanted everything to return to normal, for my shadow to behave as it had all my life. But I could no longer turn back. I knew that until I faced my own repressed fears and desires, my shadow would continue to have that control over me. So, instead of continuing to run away, I began to look inward. I started to accept those parts of myself that I had avoided. The past mistakes that haunted me, the desires I had hidden for fear of judgment, the fears I never wanted to admit. I realized that my shadow was not my enemy. It was a part of me that only wanted to be seen, acknowledged. And even though it was still hard for me to understand completely, I knew that facing it was the only path to reconciliation. The conflict I had been avoiding for years finally came to light. And the most ironic thing was realizing that the shadow, that figure that had terrified me, was nothing more than a projection of everything I had repressed within myself. Accepting my shadow wasn't an immediate or simple process. It took time to understand that what I had been seeing wasn't an external anomaly but a projection of my own being, a kind of dark mirror reflecting everything I had tried to hide. But once I came to terms with that reality, everything began to change. I decided to confront the aspects of myself that I feared the most. I realized that I had spent much of my life running from my insecurities, hiding behind a mask of perfection, afraid to show my vulnerability. There were past mistakes I had never wanted to acknowledge, fears I had left unaddressed, and desires I had suppressed out of fear of judgment from others. As I opened up to all this, I felt a kind of liberation, as if the weight of years of denial began to lift. Each day, I took a moment to reflect on my emotions, on the times when I felt uncomfortable or insecure. What part of me was trying to repress? What was my shadow showing me in those moments? And gradually, I began to understand something fundamental: the shadow is not the enemy, it is a teacher. It is not there to scare me, but to remind me that I am a whole being, with light and darkness, and that both parts are necessary for living authentically. One night, something curious happened. I was in my room, the same one where everything had begun. I turned on the lamp as usual, and for the first time in months, I looked at the wall without fear. There was my shadow, projected on the wall, but this time I didn't feel afraid. Instead, I felt a strange peace. I watched as my shadow moved in perfect harmony with me, just as it had before this chaos began. What I realized at that moment was that the shadow had never truly changed. I had changed. My perception, my fears, my insecurities, all the things I had avoided confronting, had distorted the way I saw my own shadow. Now that I had made peace with myself, the shadow was back to being what it had always been, a part of me, faithful and constant. I can't say that all my problems were resolved overnight. I still have days when I feel the pressure of my insecurities, when doubts resurface, and when my shadow seems to remind me of aspects of myself I still need to work on. But now, instead of feeling intimidated by it, I see it as an opportunity to grow, to understand myself better. I no longer run from my shadow, I accept it. The most important lesson I learned is that we all carry a shadow with us, a hidden part that sometimes scares us because it confronts us with what we don't want to see. But instead of fearing it, we must recognize it, because only when we integrate our shadows can we live authentically and fully. And now, after this whole journey, I wonder, what part of your shadow are you avoiding? Because sooner or later, we all must face that part of ourselves we've relegated to darkness. The question is, are you willing to do it? Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like your shadow follows you more closely than you'd like. Perhaps, like me, you'll discover something you weren't expecting. At the end of this journey, there is an unexpected reward that comes with understanding and accepting our shadow. What was once a source of anxiety and fear transforms into a powerful tool for self-discovery. By integrating this hidden part of ourselves, we uncover a new dimension of our identity, one that is more authentic and complete. What has surprised me the most is the freedom I have gained. By confronting my fears, insecurities, and repressed desires, I have learned to live more authentically. I no longer hide behind a facade of perfection. Instead, I embrace my imperfections and see them as an integral part of my humanity. This acceptance has brought with it an inner peace I had never experienced before. Moreover, the process of reconciling with my shadow has improved my relationships. By being honest with myself, I can be more honest with others. The vulnerability I once feared has now become a source of genuine connection with the people around me. I have found that by showing myself as I am, without fear of judgment, I build deeper and more authentic relationships. The journey is not over, of course. Each day is a new opportunity to explore and understand more about myself. But the difference now is that I face these challenges with a new perspective. My shadow is no longer a feared presence, but a constant reminder that the entirety of my being deserves to be seen and accepted. So, if you have ever felt trapped by your own shadows, I encourage you to take the first step towards self-acceptance. Facing our shadows can be frightening, but it is also the path to a more complete and authentic self. Are you willing to explore what your own shadow hides from you? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. I am sure that, like me, you will discover a source of strength and freedom that will surprise you. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope that by the end of this story, you feel inspired to confront your own shadows and find the reward that can only come with self-acceptance.